You paid $12 for a single meal. Pre-measured carrots, a small plastic pouch of sauce, half an onion wrapped in cling film, and a recipe card telling you to boil water. The same ingredients, bought loose at a regular grocery store, would have cost you around $4. You know this. You've probably done the math yourself, standing in your kitchen, unwrapping the third layer of packaging around a single clove of garlic. And yet you keep paying for it, or your neighbor does, or your coworker does, because for a few years there, it felt like the future of eating. So here is the question that should keep you up at night if you're the kind of person who thinks about business models. How does a company charge triple the price of raw ingredients, spend a fortune shipping them refrigerated to your doorstep, and still lose money on almost every single box it sends out? Because that's exactly what happened. Not to one company, but to nearly the entire industry. Blue Apron, the company that essentially invented the modern meal kit category in the United States, went public in 2017 at a valuation of over $3 billion. 6 years later, it was sold off for barely more than $100 million, a fraction of what early investors had poured into it. This wasn't a scrappy startup that never found its footing. This was a company that had millions of subscribers, national advertising campaigns, warehouses across the country, and a business model that every major food and grocery player took seriously enough to copy, and it still nearly collapsed. Understanding why takes you into one of the strangest corners of modern consumer business. A world where growth and failure can happen at the exact same time, in the exact same company, for the exact same reason. To understand the meal kit business, you first have to understand what you're actually paying for, because it isn't really the food. When you unbox a meal kit, roughly a third of what you paid covers the physical ingredients themselves. And that's already a generous estimate once you account for spoilage, sourcing multiple suppliers, and buying in smaller batches than a supermarket chain would. The rest of your money goes somewhere else entirely, and that somewhere else is the actual reason this business is so difficult to run profitably. The single biggest hidden cost in this entire industry is not the food. It's the cost of convincing you to try the box in the first place. This is called customer acquisition cost. And in the meal kit world, it is brutal. Every ad you've ever seen for one of these companies, every podcast sponsorship read, every influencer unboxing video, every direct mail coupon stuffed into your mailbox promising 50% off your first order. All of that is being paid for out of a marketing budget that historically ate up somewhere around 18% of total company revenue for the biggest players in the space. Think about that figure for a moment. Nearly 1 out of every $5 these companies made went straight back out the door just to convince new people to sign up. And that number is only the recorded marketing spend. That bet almost never paid off. And the reason is the second brutal cost in this business: churn. Churn is simply the rate at which subscribers cancel. And in the meal kit industry, it has historically been catastrophic. Independent research tracking the sector found that the average meal kit company retained only around 13% of its customers year over year. Flip that number around and it becomes even more staggering. Roughly 87% of the people who sign up for a meal kit subscription in a given year are gone by the time that year is over. You are not building a loyal customer base in this business. You are running on a treadmill, constantly replacing the customers who just left with new customers who cost you money to acquire, who will themselves probably leave within a few months, restarting the entire expensive cycle all over again. Why do people leave so quickly? Partly it's the price, since paying a premium for pre-portioned ingredients only makes sense to most people for a short novelty period before the math starts to bother them the way it's bothering you right now. Partly it's the packaging guilt, since these boxes generate an enormous amount of cardboard, ice packs, and single-use plastic, and enough customers feel uneasy enough about that waste that it becomes a genuine reason to cancel. And partly it's simply that cooking from a kit, however convenient, is still cooking, and a huge portion of the customer base originally signed up hoping to escape the mental load of deciding what to eat, only to discover they still had to chop, sort, and clean a pile of dishes at the end of the night. Then there's the third hidden cost. And this one is almost invisible to the customer entirely: logistics. A regular grocery store solves the problem of getting food to you by making you come to it, and by shipping massive pallets of goods to a single central location where thousands of customers can shop from the same inventory. A meal kit company has to reverse that entire model. Instead of one truck delivering to one store that serves an entire neighborhood, meal kit companies have to send individually packed, temperature-controlled boxes to each customer's front door, one at a time, on a schedule, every single week. That is an extraordinarily expensive way to move food. Refrigerated last-mile delivery is one of the costliest forms of logistics in the entire retail world, and meal kit companies chose to build their whole business model around it. And then there's the ingredient sourcing itself, which sounds simple until you actually try to do it at scale. A restaurant or a supermarket can adjust its ordering in real time based on what's selling. A meal kit company has to predict, weeks in advance, exactly how many people are going to choose the chicken fajita bowl versus the salmon teriyaki. Order precisely enough perishable ingredients to match that guess, and then absorb the loss when the guess is wrong. Overordering means throwing away food that spoils before it can be used. Underordering means telling paying customers that their chosen meal is unavailable this week. Both outcomes cost money and damage the exact kind of customer trust this fragile subscription model desperately needs to survive. So now you have 4 brutal cost centers stacked on top of each other. Expensive customer acquisition, catastrophic churn that forces you to keep reacquiring customers, expensive individualized logistics, and unpredictable ingredient sourcing that generates constant waste. Any one of these on its own would be a manageable challenge for a normal food business. All 4 combined, running simultaneously, is close to a structural nightmare, and it explains exactly why Blue Apron's stock chart looks the way it does. In September of 2023, Blue Apron agreed to be acquired by Wonder Group, a company built by an entrepreneur who had previously built and sold Jet.com to Walmart, for $13 a share, valuing the entire company at roughly $103 million. A company once worth over $3 billion was ultimately absorbed for the price of a modest tech startup, its meal kit operations essentially becoming a feature inside somebody else's larger food delivery ambitions rather than surviving as an independent business. While Blue Apron was falling apart, its biggest rival was telling a very different story, at least on the surface. HelloFresh, a German company that entered the American market aggressively, kept growing even as Blue Apron shrank. At various points, its American revenue was growing by double or even triple-digit percentages year over year, and it eventually captured something close to 78% of the entire American meal kit market, an almost total dominance of the category. On paper, HelloFresh looks like proof that the model can work. In practice, its own history tells a more complicated story. HelloFresh's spectacular growth years were also years of extremely aggressive marketing spend, arguably no more efficient, dollar for dollar, than what Blue Apron was doing. Analysts who studied the company closely warned that its main advantage during its fastest growth period wasn't a fundamentally better business model. It was better execution of the exact same expensive playbook, combined with a temporary tailwind that neither company could have predicted. That tailwind was the pandemic. When lockdowns hit in 2020, suddenly millions of people who had never considered a meal kit subscription were stuck at home, unable or unwilling to go to restaurants or crowded grocery stores, and meal kits looked like a genuinely convenient solution. Orders for the major players jumped dramatically almost overnight. HelloFresh's order volume roughly doubled in a single year, and the entire meal kit sector, which had been quietly struggling and consolidating before 2020, suddenly looked like a booming growth industry again. Investors poured money back in. The whole category was valued at somewhere around $10 billion combined at its peak during this period, with analysts projecting steady double-digit annual growth for years to come. But a pandemic tailwind is, by definition, temporary. And this is where the industry's underlying weaknesses reasserted themselves the moment normal life resumed. As people went back to offices, back to restaurants, back to browsing supermarket aisles in person, meal kit orders declined across the board. HelloFresh itself, despite being the dominant player, reported falling revenue and shrinking active customer counts within a few years of the pandemic peak. Exactly the churn problem the industry had always struggled with, just delayed by a couple of years thanks to unusual circumstances. The lockdown boom hadn't fixed the fundamental math of the business. It had simply masked it temporarily behind a surge of desperate captive customers who mostly returned to their old habits the moment they had a choice again. So if the underlying economics are this difficult, how has anyone in this space managed to survive at all? The answer is that the companies that lasted mostly stopped trying to be pure subscription meal kit businesses and instead turned into something broader. HelloFresh expanded well beyond weekly subscription boxes into ready-to-eat meals that require no cooking at all into on products like snacks and desserts that increase the average order value without adding much extra shipping cost, and even into selling its meal kits directly on physical retail shelves in grocery stores, sidestepping the expensive individual doorstep delivery model entirely for that portion of its business. Blue Apron made a similar move earlier in its life, selling kits inside Costco stores, essentially admitting that the direct-to-consumer subscription delivery model alone could not support the company on its own. Grocery chains themselves eventually entered the category too, and their version of this business looks completely different from the standalone startups, because they already own the one thing meal kit startups had to build from scratch: distribution infrastructure. Kroger's meal kit brand, built through its acquisition of an existing kit company, was able to sell directly inside Kroger's own stores, immediately eliminating the most expensive part of the entire model: the individualized refrigerated last-mile shipping to a customer's front door. That single structural advantage let a grocery store-owned meal kit brand cross $1 billion in sales while sidestepping the exact cost center that had bled Blue Apron dry for years. Large food conglomerates made a similar calculation, but from the opposite direction, using acquisitions instead of organic growth. Nestle, one of the largest food companies on the planet, bought its way into the space by acquiring smaller meal kit and prepared meal companies, in one case paying roughly $1 billion for a competitor called Freshly that focused on fully prepared meals rather than raw ingredient kits requiring cooking. For a company the size of Nestle, meal kits and prepared meal delivery weren't meant to be a standalone empire, the way Blue Apron's founders had once imagined. They were simply one more channel bolted onto an enormous existing food distribution machine. A machine that could absorb the losses of a struggling new category far more easily than a standalone startup ever could. This is really the core lesson hiding inside the entire meal kit story. The businesses that are still standing today, or at least the ones that are standing on solid ground, are almost never the pure, standalone subscription meal kit companies that first defined the category. They are grocery chains that added meal kits as one small extension of infrastructure they already owned. They are massive food conglomerates that treated meal kits as an acquisition to bolt onto an existing empire rather than a business to build from scratch. Or they are companies like the newer HelloFresh, which survived by diversifying so far beyond its original identity that calling it a meal kit company almost undersells what it has become. Pure subscription meal kit delivery, the original vision that got Blue Apron to a $3 billion valuation in 2017, essentially could not survive as a standalone business model once the pandemic tailwind faded and investors demanded actual sustainable profit instead of growth funded by marketing spend and cheap capital. The math was simply too punishing. High customer acquisition costs, brutal churn rates hovering somewhere around 87% annually, expensive individualized logistics, and unpredictable perishable ingredient sourcing, stacked all on top of each other, created a business that could grow explosively and lose money explosively. At the very same time, right up until the moment investors stopped being willing to fund the gap between the two. So the next time you see an advertisement offering you 50% off your first box, or a free box if you sign up today, you now understand exactly what's happening behind that offer. You are not seeing a generous company sharing its success with you. You are watching a business acquire a customer at a steep, deliberate loss, betting that you are the rare subscriber who sticks around long enough to eventually become worth the expense, while knowing statistically that most people watching this exact same ad will cancel within a matter of months. It's a bet the entire industry has been making for over a decade. And the wreckage left behind by companies like Blue Apron shows you exactly how often that bet does not pay off.